Okay, we are reading Corrie tenBoom, Keeper of the Angel's Den by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 3, titled The Prime Minister is a Fool. It was May of 1940, and there was no need for Corrie to ask her father whether he would be staying up past his bedtime at 8:45 p.m. It seemed just about everyone in Holland would be staying up. At 9:30 p.m. that night, the Prime Minister of Holland was going to make an announcement on the radio. He was going to tell the country whether or not they would be joining in the Second World War. For months, there had been talk of little else in Holland. For the past 7 months, war had raged all around them ever since Nazi Germany had invaded Poland in September of 1939. Since then, Germany had been even more aggressive, taking over Denmark and Norway. Many people predicted that Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland would be the Nazis' next targets. A number of Dutch people, though, thought that was a crazy idea. They argued that Dutch people would never have to fight in a war. Throughout World War I, Holland had remained neutral, supporting neither side. Why would World War II be any different? And besides, the Dutch had close ties to Germany. Queen Wilhelmina's late husband had been German, and the husband of Princess Juliana, next in line for the throne, was German too. Other Dutch people were not so sure. They said Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, was a madman who would not stop until he had conquered the world. So everyone in Holland nervously awaited the Prime Minister's announcement. Corrie and her father knew more about what was going on in Germany than did many people in Holland because Willem had studied for his doctorate there. Although it had been 13 years before, he had come back with a sad warning. He had even written one of his university papers on the roots of a terrible evil that was brewing in Germany. He thought that the poverty and shame of defeat that the Germans felt after World War I was a dangerous mix. He argued that the Germans were angry and bitter, and as a result were looking for someone to blame for their problems. If their anger and bitterness were ever stirred up by the government, Jewish people could be in great danger. When Willem had handed his paper in, his professors laughed and congratulated him on his wonderful imagination. They assured him there was nothing to fear in Germany. But Willem had not been able to stop thinking about the problems in Germany. He was certain they would one day spill over and infect the entire world. As early as 1933, Willem was telling his congregation about the hatred that was poisoning the German people. Whenever something didn't go well for the new German leader, Adolf Hitler, he would find someone else to blame for it. Often, it was Jewish people. Indeed, in 1933, Hitler banned Jews from holding public office, from working in the civil service, and from being teachers and journalists. Many Germans, even Jewish Germans, weren't too concerned about this. There were still plenty of good jobs a Jewish person could take. However, those bans were just the beginning. By 1935, German Jews, many whose families had lived in Germany for hundreds of years, had their citizenship taken from them. They could no longer vote or marry non-Jews. By 1938, Jews were not allowed to be lawyers or doctors. Some Jews fled to America and other parts of Europe, but many others stayed in their homes, believing things could not possibly get any worse in a civilized country. Willem, though, felt sure things would get worse for Jewish people in Germany. He tried to warn his congregation. Hitler was determined to breed a master race in Germany, which consisted of white, Christian, Northern European people. He called these people Aryans, and he wanted to eliminate anyone who wasn't part of this race. Of course, Jewish people couldn't be part of Hitler's master race. Neither could gypsies or people with physical or mental disabilities. In Hitler's mind, these people infected pure German blood and were the cause of all of Germany's problems. Getting rid of them would make Germany the greatest power on earth. But Willem tenBoom's congregation had grown tired of his warnings, which sounded more like science fiction than fact to them. So Willem had lost his position as a local church minister. Instead, the Dutch Reformed Church allowed him and his wife Tina to open a rest home for old people in Hilversum, about 30 miles southeast of Haarlem on the other side of Amsterdam. The rest home housed mainly elderly Jewish people, but Willem had told Corrie that over the past 4 years, an increasing number of young Jewish refugees from Germany had been making their way to his rest home. Each of them had a sad story to tell, and Corrie was sure that Willem wasn't repeating the worst of the stories to her. Her brother did tell her stories of Jewish people being burned out of their homes, of Jewish rabbis having their beards burned off their faces, and of Jewish children who were so scared they didn't speak for weeks after arriving in Hilversum. The stories brought tears to Corrie's eyes. Corrie wondered how anyone could hate somebody else so much to do such things to them. A few minutes before 9:30 p.m., 80-year-old Casper tenBoom adjusted the knobs on the big radio, which he'd now had for 16 years, and which, like him, took a few minutes to warm up. They could have listened to the speech on the smaller, more modern radio they had downstairs, but somehow Corrie sensed they all wanted to hear it on something old and solid, something that reminded them of a peaceful, quiet evening spent listening to orchestras. The radio hummed and crackled, and Corrie leaned forward to adjust it to the station a little better. At exactly 9:30 p.m., the voice of Holland's Prime Minister filled the room. It sounded smooth and soothing. He assured the Dutch people that the country would never go to war. He reminded them that in the past, when the rest of Europe had been at war, Holland had always remained at peace. He told the listeners that he'd spoken to both the British and the German government leaders, and no one had any intention of involving Holland in their war. Dutch people should remain calm and go about their daily business as they always did. Corrie was listening so carefully to every word the Prime Minister said that she didn't notice her father climb out of his chair, nor did she notice him walk over to the radio where he flicked it off right in mid-sentence. Corrie and Betsy, who was also listening carefully to the speech, looked at each other. What could their father be thinking? The Prime Minister hadn't finished his speech yet. Without speaking, Casper tenBoom walked to the door, where he swung around to face his daughters. I could not listen to any more of those lies, he said angrily. The Prime Minister is a fool if he thinks Holland can stay out of the war, and all who believe him are fools as well. Germany will invade Holland. We will lose. Germany will overrun us. God help all those in Holland who do not call on his name. With that, he turned and headed up the stairs. Corrie and Betsy sat in shocked silence. They had never heard their peaceful, kind father use such an angry tone of voice before. Had he really called the Prime Minister a fool? He never used language like that. So many times when they were children, he had told them to speak well of others or not speak at all. Finally, both Corrie and Betsy stood without saying a word and climbed the stairs, each to her own room. There was nothing to say, nothing to discuss. Most people in Holland went to bed that night with the assurance of the Prime Minister ringing in their ears. There would be no war in Holland. They were safe. Corrie and Betsy tenBoom went to bed with no such assurance. Deep down, they knew their father was right. Holland would surely be invaded and destroyed, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. At 2:30 a.m. that night, a loud explosion awoke Corrie. At first, she didn't know what had awakened her, but within seconds there was another explosion, and the glow of orange light through her curtains. She sat up and swung her feet to the floor. There was no doubt in her mind her father was right. German bombs were falling. Holland was under attack. Corrie grabbed her robe and headed down the stairs. She passed her father's room and listened carefully. In and out, she could hear his breathing. Amazingly, he was still asleep. She grabbed the railing and ran down the stairs a few more steps to Betsy's room. Corrie found her sister sitting on the edge of her bed and rushed into her arms. The two of them clung to each other, waiting for the noise to stop. But it went on and on. Finally, after 10 minutes, Betsy spoke. Let's go into the front room and look out the window. Corrie nodded. Holding hands, just as they had when they were young girls, Corrie and Betsy crept into the front room. They edged their way to the window and peered out. They must be bombing the airport, whispered Betsy, pointing in the direction of the bursts of orange light. Corrie nodded again, still too shocked to speak. They stood at the window for several minutes. With each blast, more orange light pulsated through the room, making the objects that had stood there for over 100 years look strangely out of place. Finally, Betsy pulled on Corrie's arm. Let's pray, she said as she sank to her knees in front of the piano stool. Corrie knelt beside her and began to pray. She prayed for the people who were being hurt or killed by the bombs that were falling. She prayed for her father, for Willem and Tina and their children, and for her sister Nolly, her husband Flip, and their children. She also prayed for Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. She even said a prayer for the Prime Minister. When Corrie was finished, she waited for Betsy to take her turn. Betsy began, God, we bring before you the German pilots up in those planes dropping bombs on us right now. We pray their eyes will be open to the evil ways of Hitler. God bless them and let them know you are with them always. Corrie opened her eyes and stared at her sister as if she were a stranger. For the second time in a single night, Corrie was surprised by the actions of someone she thought she knew well. First, her father had angrily turned off the radio and called the Prime Minister a fool, and now her sister was praying for the Germans. She closed her lips tight. She would not say anything to upset Betsy right now, but there was no way on earth she would say amen to such a ridiculous prayer. The next morning, Casper tenBoom came down for breakfast at exactly 8:15, as he always did. He read a chapter from the Bible and went to work in the clock shop at 9 o'clock. However, he didn't get much work done. A never-ending procession of people dropped by. Corrie and Betsy spent that day and the next 4 days ferrying pots of steaming coffee from the kitchen to the workshop and sales room. Corrie carried the small radio from the dining room where it was kept into the sales room. There was more news. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, 71-year-old Neville Chamberlain, had resigned, and Winston Churchill had become the new Prime Minister. When Corrie heard this, she hoped that Churchill would be tougher on Hitler than Chamberlain had been. Most of all, though, she wanted to hear what the radio stations had to say about Holland. Unfortunately, the German and English stations each said the same thing. Holland was hopelessly outnumbered by German tanks and manpower, and it would be only a matter of time before German tanks rumbled across the eastern border and occupied Holland. Luxembourg and Belgium to the south were also under attack. Some visitors to the clock shop wanted Corrie's father to pray for them. Others just seemed to want to sit at the Benge, as if somehow the peace of the tenBoom home could protect them from what lay ahead. But it could not. 5 days after the Prime Minister had promised peace, it came, but not in the way he had intended. The Dutch put up a good fight, even though they were hopelessly outnumbered by the Germans. But May 14th, 1940 became the blackest day in the history of the Netherlands. Adolf Hitler, frustrated by the way the Dutch were resisting his efforts, ordered the city of Rotterdam bombed. By the end of the day, 1,000 Dutch men, women, and children were dead, and over 78,000 were homeless. 21 churches and 4 hospitals were among the buildings that lay in ruins. When Hitler threatened to reduce the nearby city of Utrecht to rubble as well, the Dutch Prime Minister signed a surrender. The day before, Queen Wilhelmina had fled to Great Britain aboard a British warship. In London, she set up Radio Orange. Orange was the color of Dutch royalty. Throughout the rest of the war, Radio Orange broadcast news in Dutch every night, and Queen Wilhelmina often spoke to the people, encouraging them to keep fighting. When the country surrendered, many Dutch soldiers escaped to England, where they hoped to regroup and one day take back their homeland from the Germans. At first, nothing changed too much in Holland. There were German soldiers on the streets and in vehicles. Their huge truck wheels going through the puddles formed by summer showers splashed Corrie as she rode her bicycle to Nolly's house. And everywhere it seemed that people were speaking German. There was also a curfew, but it was not for 10 o'clock at night. And since none of the tenBooms were ever out that late, it didn't affect them at all. There were rules, though, which forbade group meetings, so the Triangle Club had to stop, and everyone was issued ration cards. The products that were available for purchase with the cards were listed in the newspaper on Saturday. Betsy had always been a creative cook, stretching the food money as far as it would go, so no one at the Benge really noticed the difference. Strangely enough, the clock business was booming. German soldiers were always in the clock shop looking for some souvenir to send home. The tenBoom clock shop sold more clocks and watches in the first year of occupation by the Germans than it ever had in a single year before. A few weeks after the occupation of Holland began, the Germans demanded that all radios be handed in to the Dutch police, who were now firmly under the control of the German army. Corrie would have probably sent in both radios if her nephew Peter, her sister Nolly's oldest son, hadn't spoken up. Corrie, Betsy, and Peter were sitting together in the parlor listening to Peter play a piece by Brahms on their ancient piano. When Peter was finished, Corrie sighed and patted the old radio. "I hate to have to take this down to Vroom and Jesom's store, but I received a flyer in the mail today. All radios in Haarlem are to be handed over to the Germans." Corrie sighed again and then went on, "It's been such a joy to Father, and the radio is the only way we get any real news." Betsy nodded gloomily. Corrie continued, "All you read in the newspaper is how wonderful the Germans are doing and how happy we should be to be a part of their great Aryan empire. I only buy the newspaper so Betsy can know what to buy with the ration cards. I never read the rest of it. I just use it to start off the fire in the stove." She half laughed to herself. Without the speeches from Prime Minister Churchill and the news from Radio Orange, how will we ever know how things are really going? The question hung in the air. As far as Corrie was concerned, it was unanswerable, that is, until Peter spoke up. "But don't you see, Tante Corrie, we don't have to do what they tell us. You can keep one of the radios. Why, there must be 100 places you could hide it in this old house." Amazed, Corrie turned to look at Peter. She had never thought of not doing what the Germans told her to do, but it was true. The Benge was the perfect hiding place for the small radio. Of all the houses on the Barteljordestraat, the Benge was the most irregular. Since it was actually two houses joined, there was a 5-foot difference in the level of the floors in each house. This meant there were all sorts of funny-shaped nooks and crannies around the house. When the tenBoom children were small, they had often played a game where one of them tapped on one side of a wall while one of the others had to guess what was on the other side. It was nearly impossible to know with the twists and turns of the stairs, the strange angles of the walls, and the 5-foot difference between the two houses. Corrie's imagination began to go to work. Corrie knew the Benge as well as anyone. Where was a good place to hide a radio? It would have to be easy to get to when they wanted to listen to the news. "Let's go and look at the stairs," said Peter, interrupting her thoughts. Betsy, Corrie, and Peter all walked slowly up and down the stairs. Corrie felt strange. She was a 48-year-old woman in her own home looking for some way to trick the enemy. Somehow it didn't seem quite real. Corrie began to giggle at the situation. Peter gave her a stern look, and she stopped. "Here, this is the perfect hiding place," Peter announced, stopping on the stairs just outside his grandfather's room. "Look at this. It was made to hide something. I'll pull away the planks, and you can put the radio in the hollow. I'll put the planks back on top, and you can pull them away when you need to listen to the radio." Peter smiled at his plan, and then he added, "It's close to the piano, too." Corrie didn't understand why being close to the piano was important, but Peter seemed to have thought of everything. "One of you play the piano loudly while the others listen to the news. It will work perfectly," he explained further. Corrie looked at her musical teenage nephew, and she didn't feel like giggling anymore. He should be in school preparing for university, she told herself sadly, not dreaming up schemes to outwit an occupying army. Corrie felt a flash of hatred for the Germans. The intensity of it surprised her. Later that day, Corrie carried her father's wonderful old radio off to Vroomendriesman's store. A Dutch policeman there copied the information from her identity card, which all Dutch people now had to carry at all times. When he'd finished copying the information, he consulted a list of addresses. "Cornelia tenBoom, I see there are 3 of you living at this address. Are you sure you have only one radio between all of you?" the policeman asked. Corrie looked directly in the eye. "Of course. Why would we need more than one?" The policeman grunted and waved her on. Corrie rushed home to tell Peter she had completed her first act against the invaders of her country. The Benge now had an illegal radio hidden beneath one of its stairs. That night and every night after, a member of the family would pry open the planks in the stairway and tune the radio to the BBC in London. As they did so, someone else would beat out loud, cheerful tunes on the piano to cover up the sound of the radio. When the broadcast was over, they would all gather in the parlor for a report on how the war was going. Unfortunately, the news was hardly ever good. By the end of June of 1940, France was under German occupation too. It seemed that Holland's main usefulness to Germany lay in its closeness to England. Of all the countries in Northern Europe, Great Britain was the only one that hadn't come under Hitler's rule. German bombers used the airports in Holland to launch air raids in London. While most Dutch people felt sorry for the English, they also reasoned that as long as the Germans' main use for Holland was a place from which to attack Great Britain, they were reasonably safe. The German army appeared to be passing through Holland rather than trying to change it. But Corrie had listened to all Willem had told her, and she had a feeling something awful was about to happen in her country. At first, she wasn't sure what it would be, but bit by bit, the signs began to show themselves. Soon, Corrie would be forced to make decisions that would forever change her life and the lives of those she loved.